So D4 was started about a dozen years ago as a coalition between faith-based institutions, community activists, organized labor, and environmental justice advocates, all thinking about how can we use the development process and the planning and approval process to further social, racial, and economic equity. So community benefit agreements are in our DNA in many ways. We were kind of charged with figuring out how do you take the community benefits movement that, for the most part, started on either coast and bring it to Michigan and bring it to the Detroit region. But of course, we're interested in how we can work with our partners across the state to bring it to Michigan as a whole. Um, in addition to thinking about community benefits policy, we help groups directly negotiate private community benefit agreements, and I'll get into what those are. And in general, we are interested in any policy movement that can increase affordable housing, local hiring, environmental sustainability, things like that. So today, I am planning on kind of just going over some community benefit basics. Um, and then I'm going to close while bringing up the notion of community benefits ordinances. And I'm going to then pass it off to my friend and colleague, Aaron, who knows a whole lot more about the Detroit Community Benefits Ordinance. I know he largely lives and breathes it every day. Um, and then I'm hoping we can also get into a discussion about what policies Lansing might be interested in replicating here. And I'm told that there is some interest uh, there's some interest in creating a Lansing community benefits ordinance. So my presentation closes with some thoughts about like what might Lansing consider if it were to go down that path. But first, I think it might be helpful for us to kind of identify when we're talking about community benefits, what are the types of things that we are really talking about? And I think for me, when I use the word community benefits, I'm thinking about provisions that are providing deeper affordability or more affordable housing units, anything that can require local small spaces for businesses, or perhaps retail set-asides for businesses, for women owned businesses or minority owned businesses, things like that. Local hiring provisions, anything that would promote environmental sustainability in the building of the project itself, uh, set asides for community arts or community rooms that can be, possibly reserved by local neighborhood organizations, as well as maybe some provisions that can build wealth for local residents. So, for instance, letting residents possibly invest in the project itself. I'll note that in my opinion, mitigating negative externalities shouldn't be considered a benefit because in my opinion, hopefully your normal planning and approval processes have other mechanisms to address negative externalities, right? Like the community benefits, these are really the things that are um, extra, that go beyond, that really sort of think like, okay, a building is more than four walls and a roof. How can we use it as an opportunity to promote the social good outcomes that we all want to see as citizens? So there's a number of ways that cities. Oh, a great question from Ms. Hodges in the chat. What kind of thing is a negative externality? So when I use the term negative externality, um, like for instance, pollution. If there is a factory that wants to locate within the municipal boundaries, um, and it's deemed to create pollution, obviously it would cause problems if we wanted to place that factory next to residential uses, right? Or place that factory next to a hospital. So that pollution is the negative externality. And I'm hoping that through, the just normal zoning and planning practices, we avoid those types of things. Some other negative externalities might be traffic. So a lot of, projects might like create undue traffic in the area, or, noise pollution as well. So hopefully that gives you some of what I'm talking about. Great question. Um, So there's a number of ways that cities can encourage community benefits, and some of the ones that I'm going to briefly highlight today are private community benefit agreements, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Um, Community benefits that are just inserted into other aspects of the development and approval process, right? Just into your development policies as a city, and then community benefit ordinances, which I believe to be a great interest to the group. All right, so let's quickly talk about private community benefit agreements. So, uh, if you've Googled what is a community benefit agreement, you probably have seen some version of this chart right here. And basically, a community benefit agreement is a private binding contract between a community and a developer. And so that is this sort of relationship right here. Now, sometimes that community benefit agreement can be co-signed by the government. And what is advantageous about that is it can lend itself to just greater accountability to the developer and to the contract as a whole. And in general, the relationship is sort of like, um, you know, the community benefit agreements and the community benefit provisions are reflected in the development agreement that otherwise exists between the government and the developer. And then there is an aspect of political pressure here where the community is partly getting the developer to the table because they are applying political pressure on the government to include these community benefits into the development agreement. Is that happy to pause if there's any questions about that? I mean, I think this is an important concept to get. All right, hearing none, we can come back to this if you want. Um, so a private CBA is a private contract, and these can exist outside of law, right? It's really just, um, frankly, very much dependent on how much political power the community has and to what extent the government is willing to listen to the community in incorporating those community benefits. So this private contract is very different than some of the policies that a city might enact that can consider certain types of community benefits. And so some examples of uh, those types of policies and how they might um, include community benefits are community engagement requirements. So there's many cities across the country, including Ann Arbor, that require community engagement for certain types of projects. And I would argue that that alone will help identify and yield some community partnerships and community benefits because the minute you are requiring a developer to talk to the residents that will be impacted by the project, uh, things are going to come up, right? Those types of negative externalities that I mentioned, they're going to come up. Residents, in my experience, are very quick and very smart to be able to identify how a development project is going to impact them. Some other things that might be considered are public land development standards. So, when a city is issuing an RFP, perhaps selling public land, this is another way that they can require community benefits by saying, we want this land to be developed for affordable housing, let's say, and we are looking for developers to work with us in developing affordable housing. And incentive zoning is another sort of like policy that I sort of consider within the community benefits bucket. So incentive zoning is a zoning scheme that allows developers to receive some sort of regulatory relief. Now, usually what that means is like height bonuses. So imagine like New York City, they have strict caps on the height of their buildings, but uh, a developer can be allowed to build their building higher in exchange for certain community benefits like affordable housing. Um, I should also point out that like while height is a common one, density is I think the second most common, and height and density in this case like really sort of like mean the same thing. If you're looking for some local examples, Ann Arbor for a while had density premiums within its downtown. Um, and so developers, in exchange for providing a myriad of benefits, could get greater density. I know some of those have been rejected, and they're now trying to like retool that policy and have it much more focused on affordable housing. Um, yeah. So you might be asking, Sam, these sort of like methods and mechanisms, these seem like kind of complicated. And why are we going through all of this rigmarole? Why are we going through these extra steps? Can't we as a city just require community benefits that if you're going to build in Lansing, you have to provide this level of affordable housing, or you have to hire this, number of local residents? And the answer to that is you can, but you need to make sure you're doing it legally, and you need to make sure that you're doing it, especially within what's called the Nolan-Dolan test. So the Nolan-Dolan precedent is something that was established at the U.S. Supreme Court. And basically what it says is that like if a development is being considered for approval and the city wants to require certain community benefits, those community benefits need to be directly tied to the project. So that is like the essential nexus. And here's the two parts to the Nolan-Dolan test, right? There's like the essential nexus, and it has to be proportionate. So the community benefit has to be directly tied to the project externalities through that essential nexus, and the level of benefits required have to be in proportion to kind of the harm that would be caused by the project. So those are the two parts of the test if a city just wants to require these types of things as part of their approvals process. But the second way that a city can require community benefits is if it is acting as a market actor. And here is where there is a lot more flexibility, a lot more leeway in what a government can require. Because the theory is sort of if it's acting as a market actor, right? So if it's just selling its private land, or if it's like partnering with a developer, then the developer can has the freedom to basically say like, well, no, I don't want to buy that piece of land from you, the city, or no, I don't want to partner with you, the city, because of the things you're requiring. And they have all the market freedom to move on to another site, or to work on a different type of project. And so the important thing to think about here is if a city is providing subsidy to a project, then it is usually deemed to be seen as acting as a market actor, because that developer has the market freedom to either take the subsidy or not take the subsidy. And it is that subsidy through which all of the community benefits ordinances in the country, at least the ones that I'm aware of, that they rest on, right? Because the city is, in exchange for subsidy, requiring certain benefits. Thank you for going on that like legal jargony journey with me. And by the way, during the Q&A, I am happy to bring up more examples of all of the policies that I just mentioned. I'm kind of like glancing through them and glossing through them relatively quickly because I want us to be able to get to Q&A, and I want to give my colleague Aaron Goodman a lot of time. Been happy to talk about specific examples for the policies or specific examples of private community benefit agreements. So let's talk for a minute about community benefits ordinances. I won't touch on the Detroit CBO because I know Aaron is going to be covering that in much more detail. But as we're thinking about community benefits ordinances, I think it's helpful to think about like how are those community benefits identified? And there's really sort of like two approaches here. And anyone who talks I've given, some of this research was actually sponsored by our co-learning plan through Michigan State University and the CCED. So Thank you, MSU. this this language will look familiar to you. So there's a communicative approach where the benefits are identified and agreed upon through robust stakeholder engagement, right? Everyone is sort of like coming as a blank slate, and we're identifying what benefits do we want to provide, and those are identified through uh, dialogue with the community. For the most part, the Detroit CVO is an example of that. The other approach is benefits are identified by government officials, maybe with or without community input, and they are really geared towards achieving some preset equity goals. And this is largely, in my opinion, the Cleveland Community Benefits Ordinance, right, where they are setting some set outcomes that they want to achieve. So, what outcomes you might ask? Let's get into those. So Cleveland, similar to Detroit, does something very smart. They break up their ordinance into two tiers. There's the standard level, and then there is the expanded level beyond that. So a project coming in at the standard level is a project that is receiving at least $250,000 in city assistance, and it costs less than $20 million. And you can see some of the requirements here of the standard um, CBO requirements. So a lot of it is related to local hiring, minority-owned businesses, Cleveland area small businesses, um, developers, are required to participate in some sort of mentor or protege program, provide us, apprenticeships, and then they are still required to hold regular stakeholder meetings and provide community input on an ongoing basis and submit quarterly compliance reports. And then at the expanded level, um, and I know this is a lot of text, so don't worry, I will not read this all to you. Um, but at the expanded level, these are for projects that are receiving $250,000 in city assistance and cost more than $20 million. And so projects at this level need to meet all of the standards in the previous level at the standard level, but then they also have additional requirements such as um, workforce collaborations. They have to provide job fairs. They need to unbundle contracts to make it easier for small bids and small contractors. They need to allow for some capacity building for those small businesses. One of my favorites on this list is community investment. So they need to be thinking about how can local residents be allowed to invest in the project or have some
Sam,
other.
excuse me. Could
Yep.
you explain what MBEs are and FBEs and
Sure, of course.
CSD?
Yes, I see the questions in the chat. I'm so sorry.
Uh-huh.
Um, so in this context, MBE stands for minority-owned businesses and female-owned businesses. And then Cleveland also has a new specific designation, CSB, which is Cleveland Small Business. And in essence, these are provisions that require small businesses that are led by women and or people of color. Um, yeah, so I mean, there's a lot here, and like I said, I mean, community investment is something that I find very fascinating here. There needs to be provisions for a project labor agreement with the construction unions, as well as a community equity fund um, that can support larger community initiatives. And then on top of all of that, a developer still needs to talk to the community, and it's possible that the community, on top of all of this, will identify certain needs and certain things that it still wants incorporated into the project. And so these are all the provisions that are required at the expanded level. The one sort of vulnerability that I think uh, that occurs with this. And Aaron, I know you've had more conversations recently with some of the Cleveland folks, so please feel free to weigh in during the Q&A on this if you'd like. But I don't think there's any set targets or like specific numbers or thresholds to how to what extent these various lists of things need to be incorporated into a project. To some extent, the developer is still kind of like negotiating all of these points with city officials, but they do need to be incorporating these things in some fashion. So final thoughts. You know, to some degree, I think the best community benefits agreement is the one that's needed in the first place, because to some degree, I hope that we can craft a multitude of like planning and zoning and approval processes that provide community benefits and do consider equity in other ways. But if Lansing is interested in creating a community benefits ordinance, there's some things. Whoop, this is the right slide. Sorry, y'all. If Lansing is going to create a CBO, then some things that I would recommend that it consider. One is both the Detroit CBO and the Cleveland CBO tie the threshold to square footage, to tie it to development costs, not square footage. So if you notice, the Cleveland slides that I just presented, it was projects either below 20 million or over 20 million in total development cost. I think this gets a little bit wonky, and sometimes developers will be near the threshold, but then, you know, through certain global forces, their costs might go up, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a different tier of community, benefit requirements. Uh, Ann Arbor does something where they tie some of their community benefit policies to the square footage of the project, which is just more constant, which I think is a good idea. I also encourage Lansing to think about creating tiered minimum floors, similar to what Cleveland has done, that are tied to desired outcomes. Um, Cleveland's CBO is newer than Detroit's, and I think to some extent they learned from us. And I think their establishment of those sort of like baseline requirements really saves a lot of headaches, both for the community and developers. Um, but I would also encourage you not to just rely on preordained outcomes alone, because when a large project happens, there's always going to be some things that are unique to that project that people who live nearby are going to be able to uniquely identify. So there needs to be some sort of space somewhere that still allows for that community engagement to happen and the ability for a community to identify specific needs that are tailored to their neighborhood. And then the last kind of consideration that I'm throwing out there is, um, if we are creating this sort of like tiered approach with these like set minimums and floors, uh, to my knowledge, nobody has done this, but I think it would be really interesting for us to think about like, could there be a sliding scale of, where you get this amount of subsidy if you provide this level of benefit? Or, and as you provide more benefits, that is directly tied in a very transparent way to the level of subsidy that you get. And past conversations at Michigan State University, I've talked about a incentive zoning scheme in New Rochelle, New York, where they offer density bonuses, so similar to what I was saying before, but they have a very transparent sliding scale where it's like you get 25% of the bonus, 50% of the bonus, or 100% of the bonus based on how much benefit you provide. So that is it. Thank you, everyone, and I really appreciate it and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sam. Now we're going to go to Aaron.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Sam, for the great presentation. Always enjoy partnering together on these sort of things with you. So, yes, thank you so much. So, good evening, Aaron Goodman. As has been mentioned, I am with the City of Detroit Planning and Development Department, where we have the responsibility of facilitating the community benefits ordinance process for the City of Detroit. Glad to be with you all. Glad to be part of this, and thank you again for the invitation from Lansing Empowerment Network and MSU. So as has been mentioned, Detroit does have a community benefits ordinance. There's a bit of a story for how we got to that. that I'd just like to share briefly because it was a story of community interest, community organizing, and some maybe disappointment of outcomes of projects over the years. So, we have a lot of major infrastructure projects going on, such as the Gordie Howe International Bridge. That spurred a lot of organizing in Southwest Detroit about community benefits around that and the conversation. And even before our ordinance spurred a pretty comprehensive community benefits agreement between that community, the city, state, and the government of Canada. And so they fought for a pretty significant benefits package there. Also, we have a large oil refinery that got a large tax break many years ago, and it turned out they only hired 15 Detroiters at the time, so people were a little upset about that. However, and also we have issues with those type of polluting industries creating emissions in the community. We built large stadiums in the city. And again, this is before we had the community benefits ordinance, but the Little Caesars Arena in Detroit, built 8 years ago now. It's kind of kicked off a nascent interest in having some sort of ordinance. They established a neighborhood advisory council, but it was kind of more of a, it was early efforts, I'll say that. So that all led to, Detroiters, community advocates, some city council members pushing for a greater voice for residents in these type of development deals, particularly ones that involve public subsidy, tax abatements, those sort of things. And back in 2016, we had actually two ballot proposals on the ballot at the same time, kind of competing community benefit ordinance proposals. One that had been put on the ballot by a coalition called the Equitable Detroit Coalition, and then another that was sponsored by a city council member. I won't go into the differences or the debate around that too much, but I will say that the one that's sponsored by city council was the one that ended up getting the most votes back in 2016, and it was known as Proposition B at the time, and that is the ordinance we live with now, with some amendments. So as many articles, these are news articles have been said, but this has been seen as a test for the community benefits movement. And now I'm going to tell a little bit about what we've done since that time. So as I just mentioned, this is one thing I didn't mention is that our CBO, Community Benefits Ordinance, was the first law of its type in a major U.S. city. There's been a few others since then, but we were the first to, due to a lot of visionary organizing and visionary thinkers in the city, the first to really do this. And so it was approved by Detroiters in 2016. It's been in effect since 2017. We did have some amendments in 2021, and that's where we are right now. Just a few commonly used terms, just like to define them, because we work in acronym soup a lot of times, or alphabet soup, I guess maybe that's the right word. So community benefits ordinance in Detroit specifically, that's a process for developers to proactively engage with the community to identify and address any project impacts with that development. A community benefits agreement, which Sam really kind of got into, but just to differentiate, it's a contract between a local community and a developer. It requires that developer to provide specific amenities and or mitigations to the local community or neighborhood. Traditionally. Now, I guess a little nuance to this, we have our community benefits ordinance, which is a process that does result in the community benefits agreement. But just the one difference is that's agreement between the city and the developer that's advised by the community. It's not a direct agreement or contract between the community group and the developer. So a little nuance there. Like Cleveland, we have two tiers. We call them tier 1 and tier 2. I'll talk about tier 2 first because it's kind of the lower level. And we won't spend much time talking about it the rest of the night. But just so you know, projects that are $3 million and then they are seeking a subsidy from the city of Detroit in the form of a tax abatement. And that's valued at $300,000, or they're seeking a land from the city of Detroit, also valued at $300,000. That's being transferred without open bidding, and we're getting that something with discount, and then they would be qualified for tier 2 projects. So it has to be the investment amount plus some sort of support from the city, which therefore makes us a market actor, as Sam pointed out. So why is it not advancing? Let's try this. So just real briefly for tier 2 projects, what the requirements are for that. Is the developer works with the planning department to mitigate negative impacts of the project on residents in the neighborhood. They go through something we have called concept plan review, also known as design review, where basically we have some on-staff architects and other planners who look at the project and make sure that it's fitting with our guidelines. And the developer works with the city to promote hiring, training, and employability of Detroit residents via our civil rights department and our workforce development agency. And the developer will make certain commitments about how many people they're hiring, what their plan is for hiring Detroiters. And then these developer commitments should be included with the final development agreement. I don't know. I don't have a number of how many tier 2 projects have happened since the ordinance, but I do know that we did over 70 in 2024 that went through our design review process, and it's an estimate number at this point. We're actually working to get a little better data around that, but we think that there were about 70 or so last year. On to tier 1. These are the big flashy projects. So these are projects that have construction costs of $75 million or more and are seeking $1 million or more in a city tax abatement, or a piece of property that's valued at $1 million or more and is being offered at a discount and without open bidding. And we have had 15 of these projects approved since 2017. 15 tier 1 projects. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about the tier 1 because I think it's kind of the more interesting and more engaging topic. We've had 15 tier 1 projects, as I mentioned. This is a map of the city of Detroit. You can kind of see that they tend to be clustered. If you are familiar with the city of Detroit, towards the downtown, midtown, going into the new center area, kind of in that central corridor of the city, is where we've seen the vast majority of these projects. A little bit into Corktown, if people know that area, and then one project on the east side, which we can talk about in a little more detail. Big picture overview of our tier 1 process. Again, it's a process for proactive engagement with the community. We form a neighborhood advisory council, which consists of 9 residents from the impact area. I'll talk about the impact area in just a moment. That neighborhood advisory council meets with the planning and development department and the community in a series of public meetings to identify those project impacts that they see with this proposed development. The Neighborhood Advisory Council, again, a group of volunteers, will then develop suggestions to the identified impacts, and the developer will basically respond with a proposal. That can be a bit iterative, but at the end of that process and those discussions, the city and the developer will generate an agreement in response to the impacts with the Neighborhood Advisory Council's support. Project impact area. So that was one thing I just mentioned. So that is defined by planning and development. We review the project scope, and then the impact area by the ordinance is required to include at least the census tract where the project is located. Oftentimes more, but that is the minimum per the ordinance. A notice of the first public CBO meeting is going to be mailed to all residents within that impact area and even 300 feet outside the impact area. And the impact area is really important for a couple of reasons. One, it's determined to identify who can serve on the Neighborhood Advisory Council. You have to be a resident of the impact area, reside within the impact area to serve on the Neighborhood Advisory Council. And then in our selection of Neighborhood Advisory Council members, residents of that same impact area actually vote to select 2 of the representatives on that Neighborhood Advisory Council. On the right is an example of a meeting notice we would send out for a project a few years ago. And so the CBO process is set up to focus discussion around the impact area residents, what's important to them. However, all the meetings are public and open to anyone who is welcome to come and participate in the process, give comment, give their opinion. But we do give a special emphasis to the impact area in these meetings and throughout the process. Just to kind of give you a little bit of physical idea, this is a map showing all the tier 1 projects. In blue is the actual footprint of the buildings that were built. The pink is the impact areas that are associated, and there's some overlap, particularly with projects. So many projects clustered in one area. There's definitely overlap there. But just to kind of give you an idea, you have the project footprint, and then you have a pretty sizable area around those projects where we are asking residents to come and participate, and in particular serve on the Neighborhood Advisory Council. I've talked a lot about the Neighborhood Advisory Council, but I think it's important for folks to understand how people are appointed or are elected to that process. It's 9 members. As I mentioned, they all have, and eligibility is important. One, they have to be bona fide residents of that impact area. They have to be at least 18 years of age. They have to be nominated by themselves or by someone else at the public CBO meeting, the first or the second one, and they cannot have no known conflicts of interest. And we really ask them to declare and sign an affidavit attesting to that fact, that they don't have any conflicts of interest that would prevent them from serving in this role. 2 community selections. So at our second public meeting, the folks, anyone who wants to serve that is interested in serving will nominate themselves. Then we hold an election, and top two vote getters are put on as community selections. Also, city council plays a role. So we have council by district in Detroit. So the representative from that district will appoint a member, as well as we have at-large members, and each of the at-large member will appoint a member as well. So 3 are appointed by various city council members, and then 4 are appointed by the planning and development department, as we are part of the mayor's administration in the city of Detroit. Just kind of like give you a timeline, and this is like beyond just to give you an idea of how much time actually goes into this process, from like the point where it would land on, say, my desk, to where it would get all the way through city council. And this is kind of an exercise we were doing this year. I'm sorry. This is an exercise we were doing this year to kind of like understand like the full runway of a project going through a CBO. So it takes some preparation, and we have to understand if this project is, a viable project that has its financial, house in order, and is something that can actually happen, and takes a couple months. The public meetings also take a couple months. We do about 8 or 9 public meetings over a series of 2 months. There's drafting of the agreement. And then there's approvals at the city council level as well. So all that, typically we think it takes about 6 months minimum from kind of like when it's become, at least for myself, as a live project to actually getting through to the city council approval and the NAC support and all that. A little more detail, the public meeting schedule is typically about 10 weeks. We have a series of public meetings. This is kind of like a very rough outline of what that looks like week to week, but we are meeting almost every week during this process. Either the Neighborhood Advisory Council is having working sessions, or we're presenting information, the developers presenting information. We hold a training for the Neighborhood Advisory Council. We try to give them as many resources as possible because we recognize that they are volunteers. Some of them are familiar with development, many are not. They're bringing their own expertise, but they're being asked really to put in a lot of time and effort over a very condensed period of time, and to serve their communities and to represent their neighbors in this process. Once the CBO public meetings are completed, and I see the question in the chat. So no, these are volunteer positions. So yes, they are not compensated, although we do try to provide dinner during the meetings for the residents, or we ask the developer to actually. So once the tier 1 meetings are completed, there would be a letter of support, and that's how the NAC formally expresses its support for the community benefits package as presented. The planning and development, we write a whole report about the process. And we try to be very transparent, throughout the process. In the age of Zoom, even though we're holding in-person meetings now, we still provide a hybrid option that allows us to also put the recordings of the meetings on our website. We post all the documents, as soon as we have them. So, we try to be very kind of like open and transparent, and the final report is no different. That's all included as a development package submitted to City Council, along with the community benefits report and the agreement, which is signed by the developer and the city. And then City Council then has the opportunity to review and consider that, whether they want to approve that along with the underlying abatement or incentives request. And at that point, we move into our monitoring enforcement period, which consists of annual update meetings for a certain period of years and biannual compliance reports done by our Civil Rights Department, which continue until until the project is complete and the provisions have been satisfied. And we have a website where we host all these documents. Just to get real nitty gritty, community benefits provision. So there's a few things that are always in there. The list of the benefits the developers has agreed to provide, the enforcement mechanisms of the community benefits provision, the community engagement requirements, and the requirement for the developer to submit compliance reports. This is an example of what a compliance report may look like. It's a lot dated, but this is a summary, and then there's also a lot more detailed information. They tend to be quite a few pages long. So because some of these agreements have dozens of individual provisions, and there's a narrative finding attached to each one twice a year. But those reports are produced twice a year. Citizen inquiries can be submitted and reviewed by city staff if people have questions about how things are going on, and there's also a formal complaint process that could be initiated by Neighborhood Advisory Council and investigated by there's an enforcement committee that the ordinance lays out. Again, just a little bit about outcomes. I know we're kind of getting towards the end here. I want to leave time for questions. So these Tier 1 projects, they've really been some of the most transformational projects that happened in the city of Detroit in the last 8 years. Any of the big projects you've heard about, if you pay attention to the development of Detroit, have largely gone through this Tier 1 process. Nearly $12 billion in investment, 4,000 new housing units, millions of square feet of new commercial and office space, industrial space, 33,000 estimated construction jobs, 24,600 estimated permanent jobs associated with these projects, and $2 billion of estimated net revenue benefit to the city of Detroit over the next 35 years. Now, to be fair, not all the projects that have gone through this process have been built or are fully operating at this scale yet, but this is the projections at the time of the process, which is something that we share with the community and for them to consider, for each project. This is the aggregate. Some of the notable CBO projects since 2017, you may have heard of them. We have a new Stellantis FCA assembly plant on the east side of Detroit. The Hudson's building, we're on the site of the former Hudson's department store, which is very nearly complete and has changed the skyline of the city. The train station, Michigan Central, that Ford has redeveloped, and I think has really become a showpiece for historic preservation and also community investment in the form of their community benefits agreement. Fisher Body Plant 21, which is up in our New Center, Milwaukee Junction area, is an old auto factory that is becoming over 400 apartments. The District Detroit, which is affiliated with Olympia, the Illich's family, is a multi-building development proposal that went through this process a couple years ago, and is very ambitious, and hopefully the first project will be breaking ground this year. And then finally, I'll just mention the Future of Health, which is the partnership actually with Michigan State University, Henry Ford Health, and Detroit Pistons to create a new world-class medical and research campus, a brand new Henry Ford Hospital, housing, and a medical research building as well. Resident engagement, because that's really key to ours, just some top level numbers. As I mentioned before, 15 Tier 1 projects. That's meant 110 public CBO meetings across those projects, 131 Detroit residents that have served on neighborhood advisory councils, and over 2,000 residents that have participated in some way in these processes for over those 15 projects. I think that one of the most important outcomes, we can talk about like the concrete, agreements, but listening to neighbors, having a positive impact on development. This process is designed to really create an opportunity for meaningful community engagement on private developments, where the community has an opportunity to express the potential project impacts as they see them in direct dialogue with the developer. Every week, they are meeting with the developer on a public meeting and getting information, asking questions, and having the discussion. The developer has a chance to hear what's important to the community in that dialogue. The community is also better informed about the project and construction timelines. And then, just kind of the summary statement is serving on the NAC really is providing Detroiters the opportunity to meaningfully impact the city's growth and development. But of course, we like to talk about numbers too and concrete things. So, I think this is my last slide. But, excuse me, cumulatively over those 15 projects, we estimate that there's been about $50 million worth of direct developer commitments, contributions to programs, different funds, that sort of thing. And additionally, it's been estimated that the benefits of these projects, maybe through in-kind things or other types of activities, is possibly worth up to $800 million in cumulative community benefits across 15 developments. Now, that doesn't mean $800 million worth of direct, spending to a community fund or donations of that sort of thing. But that's been kind of the estimated impact by the city as we've gone through some of these. Some of the types of the benefits that have happened are examples about going into specific details: construction management and mitigation efforts above and beyond, what's required by code, parks and public space improvements, the site improvements, the site design and traffic mitigations, the accessibility of housing and public spaces, particularly for our disability community, improvements to parking and public transportation impacts, job commitments, going above and beyond even the workforce development space, investing in affordable housing, either within the project or even to some of our affordable housing funds, increased support for local business and retail, increased public engagement around the project, paying attention to environment and sustainability concerns, and then also supporting community initiatives through sometimes monetary donations and otherwise. So that is where I will end. So I want to thank you again. I know we're going to have time for questions. I'm going to stay on the call even if I go off camera and start moving, but I'll be available to answer questions. But this is my email address. Feel free to reach out. I can put this information in the chat as well if you want to learn more. Our website's a great resource if you want to learn more in depth about any of the projects. And so thank you again. I think we'll pass it off to Mr. Evans to moderate questions.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Before we get into the Q&A, I want to thank our subject matter experts, Aaron and Sam. I also want to thank Dr. Rex Lamore and his staff, especially Henry Jarrett. They were very, very helpful and supportive of this project. So, Q&A. Questions? Trini.
Hey, good evening. I'm not sure if my camera is working properly, but I have a lot of questions. Carlton, if you need me to stop asking questions at some point, please let me know. If someone else raises their hand, tell me it's someone else's turn.
Go for it.
So this, Aaron, Sam, and the rest of your team, I actually serve as a council member here in the city of Lansing. Really interested in this concept. I wasn't very familiar with what a community business agreement meant. So I did some research. I did find the Detroit page and the information that actually you shared through that QR code. I did read through that. I guess my first question would be the difference between a community business agreement and a community business ordinance. I think that some community members might feel that they want to not have government so involved, so it truly reflects the wants and needs of that neighborhood, of the community, versus an ordinance that's crafted by people, serving in these positions or, by the government and then asking for input. So I'm curious from what you've seen, what you've heard, your work in this field, is there an option that works better than the other? Is there an agreement that exists that doesn't so heavily involve the government? And if it does, are the outcomes any better versus when you have more government involvement? If that doesn't make sense, let me know. I can try and ask it a different way.
Aaron, I have a quick thought. But yeah, please chime in if you'd like, Aaron. So, great question. I think I actually think there is an advantage to the government having some role with a private community benefits agreement. There's an example here in Detroit where it was a private agreement between the developer and the community group. The city was not a co-signer, nor was that agreement embedded in the developer's development agreement with the city. And while the developer is mostly complying with what they promised, there's little recourse that the community has to hold that developer accountable. The best CBAs like have some sort of like hard language that even says, the community can like sue a developer if they don't follow through on their promises. But we should also be realistic about the power imbalances there, right? Because the community most likely doesn't have the same like money and legal resources that a large developer may or may not have. So here's where I think the government coming in and at least like signing on to that agreement can help hold the developer accountable.
Thanks. I think you got to the heart of my question. Like, what recourse is there if the government is not involved? And so, thanks for answering that question. I see another hand raised, so I'll hold the rest of mine.
Thank you, Trini. We'll have Anne Marie ask her question, and then we'll come back to Trini if there's no one else. Anne Marie.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Let's see how to be succinct. I'm interested in whether there are mechanisms for examples of communities and as represented by not the government, but some other community-based organization, community-powered organization. Is there a way in which, well, I guess it could even be, okay, they can start to actually benefit monetarily, like very, very directly. And I'm interested in the idea that a community could build equity either in ownership of property and or actual funds that are used to create endowments for that they could then, kind of spin off and do things they want to do that really are removed from the initial development projects or any binding kind of things there. Do you know examples of that? Because it seems like you talked about the power imbalance. I guess I'm getting at that is like, how do you get the community, quote unquote, to a place where eventually they are a player at the table? They're not so disempowered in that connection. Thank you.
I love that question, Ms. Hodges. So yeah, I think there's several examples where, as part of the community benefits agreement, the developer has to contribute to some sort of local impact fund. In Aaron's presentation, he mentioned Michigan Central. That is just one example here in Detroit where a developer had to set aside funds that then went to the local community foundation for localized grants in the neighborhood. And then the community helped advise what those grants were spent on. There's an example in Atlanta where actually the impact fund was just housed within a local neighborhood organization, and they, had full control over what the money was spent on. I also am very excited about some recent examples where community residents themselves as individuals are allowed to invest in a project. So they have like a fractional ownership stake, but then they're allowed to reap the financial dividends. Eric, I know excuse me, Aaron, I know you're probably in transit, but was there anything you wanted to add about like either the Michigan Central Fund or anything?
Sure. I mean, I think you mentioned some of the things. in the case of Michigan Central, Sam described it accurately that that they created a fund that through the community foundation, but it's really that fund is designed to basically support community-based projects, kind of small scale community-based projects. I think your question, and I really respect it, Anne Marie, really speaks to the idea of almost like community development in general. And how do you build up the capacity within organizations to actually do community-based development? Because a lot of, I think, what community benefits agreements are doing, community benefits ordinances are doing, are intervening in, large-scale private development to ensure some sort of public benefit out of it beyond, kind of what is standardly accepted. So I think what you're suggesting is, I don't want to say it's reactionary, but it is in a little bit a way. And what you're talking about something like very more proactive in terms of building up the community's capacity to really shape the vision and what's going on. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Neighborhood planning is one way, but also the building up of community development organizations. The community benefits agreement, I think, is a way as well, but because you're kind of reacting to someone else's vision, it may not always, you may not get that kind of holistic view that you're looking for out of that process. But I think it can be a piece of the puzzle, and I think we've seen examples of that from the projects in Detroit.
All righty. Henry, can we go further than 7:15?
Yeah, as long as Sam and Aaron are willing to. I know you guys are on pretty busy, so if you guys want to stay, I think that would be all right.
Okay, thank you very much, Henry. Doak.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just to try to make this concrete, the recent controversy in Lansing over the demolition of Eastern High School. I'm just wondering if this had been in place, would things have gone differently? Could things have gone differently? Or was the process that happened there similar to this? If people know that process.
I guess
this is a case of U of M demolishing a building that this community very much wanted to preserve.
Well, I think in terms of a local ordinance being able to speak to that, and U of M being a state actor, if it's a state or government project, this ordinance, the city's Detroit's ordinance wouldn't apply. It strictly applies to private developments. So, and I don't think any ordinance crafted at a local level would basically be able to like dictate to the university or the state government what they can and can't do. I mean, that's true even of the zoning code, I believe. So then it really is a community organizing kind of question and a community power kind of question. But it won't be through an ordinance, it would be through advocacy in that particular case.
Nancy,
the particulars of the case matter. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Nancy, you had a question?
Oh, thank you. I might lose my voice here. So here in Lansing, we've had issues with developers. They'll purchase a property, they'll go before city council, they pitch a really great plan, and then the property sits untouched for years. Is this something that you have experienced in any of the neighborhood developments?
Yes. It's pretty common in general. Sorry, Sam, I saw you come off mute.
No, Aaron, yes, I think it is pretty common, as Aaron said. Nancy, I was literally typing an answer to your question when you said it. I mean, I think ideally, when the development, is given its approvals and there's some development agreement, that there's like clearly identified timelines and clawback provisions. I mean, I think that's probably just good practice for all municipal governments to to implement.
I mean, I'll follow up because my comment was like generally globally, this is a problem throughout Detroit, not necessarily for just for major development projects. I will say that if something's going to enter into our process, the community benefits agreement, which is why we have so much preparatory time, we are loath to really move it forward into a public process unless we think it has a very good shot of actually moving forward. And it hasn't worked 100% of the time. We've learned some things over the years. We've had some projects that have gone through our community benefits ordinance process, which is a huge investment of city staff and community time and political time and effort, capital. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. And nobody wants to go through all that if the project's not going to happen. So we try to be pretty sure. Can't predict the future. Things that happen in development world, pandemics happen, inflation happens, all the stuff that's really impacted us over the years. But more generally, we have lots of people that buy property, sit on property, and never do anything with it. But we try to avoid that in the CBA process, at least.
In the interest of time, I'm going to go to Trini right now. She has something she wants to request from you two, and she probably has at least one more question.
Sure. So I do have several questions. In the interest of time, I'll ask one and then ask your permission if I can email the rest to you, if that's okay. Okay, thanks. So when you gave the Cleveland example, there was a very lengthy list for some of the I guess some of the requirements that could be tied to their community business agreement. And so, for instance, one that stuck out to me was the project labor portion, right? Like, that's something that Lansing has included into our agreements now. So, I'm wondering, like, is there a threshold there in the Cleveland example? Like, it was like a very long list. Do the developers have to abide by every single bullet point, or is there a threshold? Like, if you do 5 of these items, or if you agree to 2 of them, then we'll move forward in the process. Like, how do you determine which benefits are included in a particular agreement?
So I'm actually going to defer to Aaron on this because I think he was in some recent conversations with the folks at Cleveland to understand that process a little bit better. Aaron, am I correct that there isn't a set threshold? Like each point is kind of negotiated on its own?
This is my understanding, and again, I'm still definitely learning more, but have had some conversations, and I actually went to Cleveland in April and talked to some folks. But yes, I think a lot of it's negotiated kind of with city staff in Cleveland. But one thing I am aware of that they've talked about recently that I need to learn more about is they have developed kind of like a development scorecard. And so they're starting to kind of put some metrics around, basically, if your project hits this many benefits that equal this many points, then you're going to be good. I think maybe for the larger projects, if they have their standard agreement and they have I think this is more applying to their expanded agreement, which is the larger projects. So yes, that's something they developed, this kind of scorecard to kind of help them know when something is hit the threshold where they feel comfortable with it moving forward and it's delivering enough in terms of benefits.
Okay, thank you.
All right, folks. On behalf of the Michigan State University Center for Community and Economic Development, Director Rex Lamore and the Lansing Empowerment Network, we really appreciate you folks coming. We will have access to a recording of this webinar. It will be on the LEN website. And I'm sure Sam and Aaron will be happy to receive questions if you have more. So thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening.